It is Cristo, it's Talk Radio, and it's Drive.
Cristo on Talk Radio.
Let's put some of those big points and those big stories to our political panel this evening. Asad Rehman on the left is the Civil Liberties campaigner. On the right, Jason Reed, UK lead at Young Voices and political commentator. Evening to you both.
Good evening, Cristo.
Thanks very much indeed for your company this evening. I mean, before we get on to anything, just because I referenced it, and I know it wasn't the stories that we particularly had said that we'd talk about, but I know I can throw anything at you both. I mean, if Rishi Sunak's wife isn't doing anything illegal, what's wrong with her doing that? Surely it's the laws you should be angry at rather than the person who is acting within the law, Asad?
Yeah, well, I think there should be a basic expectation that the wife of the Chancellor of Exchequer should be paying what she owes. And, of course, your listeners, we'll find it strange that the person who sets the rules is her husband. Is it legal? Yes. Is it fair? No. Is it morally wrong? Yes, it's morally wrong. So maybe the question we should be asking ourselves is, why hasn't the Chancellor acted to make sure she pays what she owes? And especially when the poorest in our society are being hit with a national insurance tax increase. Look, paying our taxes is really good. We all have to do that because it creates a society.
Why is it really good? Why is it really good to have to give the government more of your hard-earned money for them to mismanage?
Well, because the schools, the hospital, the roads, the fact that we don't have to worry if we get sick or out of work, it's our collective safety net. Together, it helps us build our society where, you know, we aren't living in the dark days where children are forced to go up chimneys to work or people are left to die in workhouses. That's why we create the society, and we all contribute fairly to that. Look, I think the real problem is we have a small group of very, very super rich people. They have their friends in Parliament who they wine and dine, and we've seen them all, give them all fancy holidays, and who write tax rules that let them, and it's not just about individuals, but also big corporations, McDonald's, Amazon, Google, all be able to dodge their taxes. And, you know, I think that we have to do something about it. For me, I'm hoping that this attention on just not her case, but on the wider issue about people dodging their taxes, these big corporations, would shame them to actually do their fair share. And I remember being involved in a campaign a few years ago about Starbucks and shame them, and suddenly they stumped up 20 million to pay their taxes. So,
all right, Jason, I mean, Asad has a good point. This is all about sort of being part of a collective society, and yes, she may be within the letter of the law, but morally, is she doing the right thing?
Well, we can always point our finger at tax loopholes, and I think there will always be tax loopholes. The reason this is in the news is not because a person has non-dom status. The reason it's in the news is because it's linked to the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak. And Rishi Sunak has worked very hard over the time he's been in government to craft his public image. His polling numbers were through the roof last year when Partygate was really taking hold, and lots of people were saying that he was the logical successor for Boris Johnson. But I think his chickens are now very much coming home to roost. We've had a few stories that have been unfavourable to him quite recently. Of course, he made that huge £100,000 donation to Winchester, to his old private school. Now we've got questions about his household finances. We've also had questions about links to money coming in from Russia via his wife's company, via dividends, all these things which are just making life a little bit more difficult for the Chancellor, and maybe pointing to the fact that he's not one of the people as he wanted us to think, and he's not the leader who's going to lead us to freedom out of this cost of living crisis, because he doesn't quite understand what a cost of living crisis actually means.
But none of that has any bearing on his wife doing something within the law.
Technically, it's within the law, but we can all see that clearly it's not within the spirit of the law. This is, I don't know the details of the technicalities of being a non-dom. It does appear like she is playing a loophole of some kind, because she's claiming that she's not domiciled in the UK, whereas she does live in number 11 in Downing Street. So it's perhaps unclear how long that situation can continue with the amount of public pressure that's going on. So the problem might just solve itself in that sense.
OK, let's move on to some other stories of the day. NATO saying that they're going to up the support towards Russia, offering them more weapons. Yesterday we saw the Czech Republic sending tanks. Do you think that this is essentially an escalation? And why is it that this is allowed to happen when presumably, well, it wasn't even presumably, it's true that the reason that we were told that the escalation couldn't happen previously was because of Putin making these threats about the nuclear button. So why is it now that NATO can step up, and why couldn't they do before? There are so many questions around this. Assad, go.
Well, I work for an organisation whose slogan and whose name is War on One, and it was coined actually after countless horrors of countless wars, and that the only war worth fighting was the war against poverty. And frankly, anybody, I think, looking at Ukraine and seeing the suffering of the Ukrainian people can only have one goal in mind, right? How do we end this conflict? How do we save lives? And how do we stop and prevent these kind of brutal invasions and occupations? Look, if we look back over these, even the last 10, 20 years, we can really see the answer isn't really pouring more arms into any conflict. In fact, it seems to be the only people it ever benefits seems to be the companies who sell the arms. We all know there's going to have to be a diplomatic resolution to this. So, first of all, I think, when you take a step back, so, well, why isn't the rule of law applying? Look, after the Second World War, the world community came together, said never again. We created international mechanisms, including the International Criminal Court. And then we've got countries, including our own, who trash it because it talks about our allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel. We've got US not signing up to it. We've got Russia not signing up to it. So we've created a world where lots of countries and leaders think they have impunity for their actions. And secondly, I think, whilst I was listening to your piece about the UN vote, I think we should be talking about how do we reform the UN? Why isn't the UN actually bringing all sides to the table? And that, of course, as we know, is because 5 countries, the US, France, UK, China and Russia, have veto powers. They shouldn't have veto powers, right? We live in a world where all of the views of the countries matter, not simply these 5 powerful countries who can decide, if what they do is legal and what anybody else does is illegal. Thirdly, I would much prefer to be seeing more action about the sanctions, the billionaires who are propping up Putin, the fossil fuel industry who's bankrolling him, rather than saying, well, this is going to be a slog to the death. And ultimately, parts of Ukraine are going to be leveled to the ground. And I don't think it's going to help the Ukrainian people in the long run.
What do you say, Jason?
I think some of what Assad said there sounds like he's living in fantasy land, that we can just have a diplomatic solution. If we just get everyone around the table, we can all, hold hands and sing a song together and everything will be fine. That's not how the world works. The only language that Vladimir Putin understands is violence. We of course want to end the war, but we don't want to end the war at any cost. Zelensky could end the war tomorrow by giving up loads of sovereignty in Ukraine, but that would only lead to more horrors down the road as Russia exerts its awful rule in Ukraine and tries to govern what would probably be an ungovernable region. It will also provide a big incentive to other countries around the world who are considering doing what Russia did. I'm thinking, for example, of China eyeing up Taiwan. Sending weapons, sending tanks, sending armaments to Ukraine is the absolute minimum that we should be doing, let alone an escalation. It's what we owe to the Ukrainian people. It's what we owe to the basic values of freedom and democracy and sovereignty. And of course, ideally, we would all sit down and sort it out in a meeting, but that's just not how it's going to work.
But isn't that, the frustration I have with this isn't that eventually what's actually going to end up happening? So it's going to escalate, and more people are going to die, and more people are going to die, and maybe NATO will engage with Russia, and it'll get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and then eventually both sides will end up sitting down and negotiating, and we'll have to give concessions on both sides, but there will be X number more people that have died in the process. And my worry is that that's going to be what happens whilst we're all sticking our heads in the sand. Jason?
It only makes sense for Ukraine to start making concessions when there is no other option. If they had started making concessions on day one of the invasion, they were in a much, much weaker position then, because most people expected Russia to walk all over Ukraine and take it in a matter of days. Now, Russia has been embarrassed, it's been humiliated. They've had to halt their attacks in the west of the country. They've had to halt their attacks in the capital. They're focusing on the Donbas regions in the east. The Ukrainian people, in other words, have done extremely well, much, much better than anyone was predicting. And that is because of in large part, because of the arms that have been sent from the west, from Britain and from other countries. And to say we should stop doing that now when they very clearly do not want to give up the fight, it's completely ludicrous. I think we owe them the ability to keep fighting.
Last word from you, Asad.
Well, Jason, I mean, if we look at a comparable conflict, we've poured billions in arms and weaponry and money to support the Saudis bombing Yemen. We had 750,000 people, involved in that conflict in terms of casualties. We have millions of people on the brink of starvation. We know the reality of many of these conflicts. They just go on and on and on and on. I think you're absolutely right, Cristo, that the end point is going to be the international community will have to sit down and have to resolve it. We have to stop the war. Do you do that after, the death toll is 200,000, 1 million? When do you stop? So I don't think the question is how do you appease authoritarian countries, whether it's Russia, Israel, any of these who are occupying other land. Of course, that requires a strong international order. That requires an international community to say, we will not tolerate this. The reason people feel they can do it is because they say it's hypocritical. Nobody really believes that the international community will step in and stop invasions or occupations. We have to actually, if we genuinely believe it, we have to live up to it in everything we do.
We shall see what happens next. Asad Rehman, Civil Liberties campaigner, Jason Reed from Young Voices, political commentator. Thank you for taking the time here on Talk Radio.